Before we begin, let me ask you something simple. If your freedom was taken away, your family broken apart, your body worked until it failed, and then slavery was finally abolished, who do you think deserved compensation? The people who suffered or the people who owned them? Because in Britain, the answer was very clear. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And as you listen, ask yourself whether you were ever told this part of the story in school. In 1833, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act. It is often described as a moral victory, a moment of national pride, a turning point in history. Textbooks say Britain led the world, that it chose conscience over profit. But what they rarely explain is what happened next. Because when slavery ended, freedom did not come alone. Money moved first. After abolition, the British government made a decision that still shocks people today. They decided to compensate slave owners, not the enslaved, not the families torn apart, not the people who had worked without wages for generations. The owners. The logic was cold and legal. Enslaved people were considered property, and when the state took away that property, it believed the owners deserved repayment. So Britain borrowed an enormous sum of money, 20 million pounds. At the time, that was around 40% of the government's entire annual budget. It was one of the largest bailouts in British history, and every single penny went to slave owners. Let me slow this down for a moment. Britain did not just allow former slave owners to keep their wealth. It actively paid them for the loss of the human beings they had enslaved. Ask yourself this. If slavery was truly wrong, why were its beneficiaries rewarded? And if abolition was a moral act, why did that morality stop at the bank? Here's where the story gets even more uncomfortable. The British government didn't have that kind of money just lying around, so it borrowed it. From banks, from financiers, from institutions that are still with us today. And who paid back this massive loan? British taxpayers. For generations. In fact, the debt used to compensate slave owners was not fully paid off until 2015. That means people alive today, people like you and me, were still paying for the profits of slavery long after it had supposedly ended. And all the while, the enslaved themselves received nothing. So what did the formerly enslaved people receive instead? Freedom did not come with land, or money, or support. Instead, they were forced into something called an apprenticeship system. This meant they had to keep working for their former owners for years, unpaid. They were still controlled. They were still punished. Slavery had ended in name, but for many, the reality on the ground had barely changed. The power dynamics were still firmly in place. And where did all that compensation money go? The records still exist. They show us exactly who got paid. The money went to plantation owners, of course, but also to merchants, to politicians, to clergy members, to widows and heirs who had never even set foot on a plantation. Some families used this massive cash injection to buy grand country estates. Others invested it in the new industries of the time, railways, banks, and even universities. Significant parts of modern Britain were literally built with the money paid out to compensate for the end of slavery. It all happened quietly, respectably, and without any real acknowledgement of where the money came from. For generations, this part of the story just faded away. Abolition was celebrated as a great national achievement. The compensation was rarely, if ever, mentioned, because it complicated the nice, clean narrative. It raised deeply uncomfortable questions. Questions like, can a nation be both moral and exploitative at the same time? And if a nation's wealth was built on a foundation of injustice, who inherits the responsibility for that? Let me ask you something directly. If your own family had been enslaved, and you discovered that the people who owned them were paid a fortune for your ancestors' freedom, how would that make you feel? And why do you think this part of history is still so rarely discussed in our schools and in our media? This is not ancient history. The wealth created by slavery didn't just disappear. It moved. It grew. It compounded over time. It became the foundation for institutions, for influence, and for generational stability. Meanwhile, the formerly enslaved communities were left to rebuild from absolutely nothing. No compensation, no apology, no safety net. The enormous gap in wealth and opportunity that followed was not an accident. It was designed. Today, when people talk about the idea of reparations for slavery, this history is absolutely central. Because the fact is, Britain already paid reparations. They just paid them to the wrong people. And when that fact is raised, it's often met with discomfort, with silence, with defensiveness. But history doesn't disappear just because it makes us feel uneasy. So I have a final question for you. Do you believe that compensation should have gone to the enslaved people instead? Do you think Britain has ever truly reckoned with this decision? Or has the celebration of abolition been used as a shield to avoid these much harder, more complicated conversations? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read them all. And if you've made it this far and you're not subscribed, maybe ask yourself why. This channel exists to tell the parts of history that are usually skipped over. If you care about truth, about memory, and about facing uncomfortable facts, then you should be here. Subscribe. Share this with someone who thinks they already know the story of abolition. Because history doesn't just live in the past. It lives in what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget.